How's it going, guys? Today we're going to be continuing our look at World War II for the United States. Now, today's lesson, will be more of a kind of a bridge lesson in which we kind of wrap up our look at the war in the Pacific, and then we turn to the war in Europe. Next week we'll be looking at kind of how the war impacted the U.S. on the home front, which is going to be our kind of bigger focus since we have a more US-centric focus for this class. And also, last year you most likely learned a lot more about World War II and the actual battles and stuff like that. So we're not going to really spend too much time on that, although we will go over it today. Our big focus is how the war impacted the United States as a whole. So that'll be next week. But for this week, we're going to kind of wrap up our look at both the wars in the Pacific and in Europe. So the first thing you're going to do is on your Google Doc, you're going to answer this discussion question. Killing one to save many is always justified. To what extent do you agree with the statement? There is no right or wrong answer. Just go ahead and kind of write down what you think is your thoughts on the answer. Okay? So, moving on. Now, to briefly wrap up our look at the Pacific Theater, we're going to talk about the atomic bombs. And you can't tell the story of World War II or the Cold War, really even just the 20th century as a whole, without talking about the atomic bombs. Now, the bombs were eventually dropped on Japan. We'll kind of talk about why they were dropped on Japan and kind of the decision-making process that went into it. Your other activity for this week will be looking at some different arguments for and against the bombs, and then kind of coming up with your own argument as to whether or not the use of the bombs was justified. And you'll be looking at that on Google Docs or Google Classroom in just a minute. But first, let's go into some background about the bombs. Now, the genesis of the atomic bombs came from Albert Einstein, essentially. The Germans had been developing or trying to develop their own versions of the atomic bombs in Germany at the time. And Einstein, being, a physicist and a scientist in Germany, he knew of this being done. At this point, Einstein had fled Germany and come to the United States, but he still had a lot of contacts in Germany and knew that the Germans were trying to get their hands on this weapon. He knew that if the Germans were the first to do so, they would use the bomb, and he viewed it as they would use it for the wrong reasons. It's unclear who or where it would be, who it would be used on or where it would be used, but he knew that the Germans could not get the bomb. So he wrote a letter, or signed a letter, really, from a bunch of different scientists in the United States to the President Roosevelt, who then decided to create or turn the U.S.'s attention towards creating our own atomic bomb. This became known as the Manhattan Project. Now, the Manhattan Project was based in Manhattan, in New York, but in reality it was done or carried out across the country. There were laboratories in New Mexico, in Berkeley, really in the four corners of the U.S. And it was such a secret project that a lot of people who were working on it had no idea what they were actually working on. They were each working on a very small aspect of the bomb, or what became the bomb, and thus they're able to keep it secret because, again, they were fearful of any sort of espionage or any other enemies trying to get their hands on the bomb before we could get it ready. Now, the Manhattan Project eventually reached its goal in creating an atomic bomb when the first one was tested at Los Alamitos in New Mexico. Once that was done, we knew that the bomb was ready to be used. The question now was, should we use it? And this became a very controversial topic. Now, again, let me reiterate for a second here that very few people knew about the creation of the bomb. In fact, President Truman, who was vice president before Roosevelt passed away, had no idea the bomb was a thing. When Roosevelt passed away, his advisors were like, hey, President Truman, you're now president, and guess what? We have an atomic bomb, and you have to decide whether to use it. So, quite the bombshell, no pun intended, was dropped on him at that time. So, the main argument for dropping the bomb was that Japan would not surrender unconditionally. That meant that there would be no negotiations, that the U.S. would dictate the terms of the peace, and we would basically end the war on our terms. The Japanese were especially against the idea of the emperor being removed from the throne. Remember, the emperor was seen as essentially a descendant of God in imperial Japan at this point. And so that was viewed as something that was non-negotiable. But the U.S. wouldn't agree to any sort of surrender without that being done. Along with that, we also have the events of the battles of Okinawa, of Iwo Jima, basically the Japanese being very fanatical in their defense of their territory, right? As I mentioned last week, in a lot of these battles, Iwo Jima, right, 20,000 or so Japanese defenders, about 19,000 were killed before the Japanese actually gave up control of the island. One guy stayed on the island. I don't think it was Iwo Jima, but one Japanese soldier would refuse to surrender until 1976, a good 21 years after the war officially ended. And so for the Americans, there was this kind of fear that attacking the mainland of Japan, the main islands of Japan, would lead to enormous amounts of casualties on both sides. And so with the kind of reluctance for Japan to surrender unconditionally and the fear of a potential invasion that was called Operation Downfall, that's this last bullet point here, the Americans turned their attention towards the atomic bombs, and they viewed the bombs as potentially a way to end the war more quickly and with less bloodshed. Again, you'll be researching more about the decisions to use the bomb when you look at the documents on Google Classroom, but the two bombs were used on August 6th and August 9th on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These two cities were chosen mostly because they were, for the most part, industrial targets where they were producing stuff, but there are many civilians there as well. Again, another big point of contention was where to use the bombs. There are a lot of cities in Japan that were potential targets for the bombs. Some people who argue against the bombs would say, well, they could have done it, over the ocean so the Japanese could still see it to scare them off, but not kill as many people. Whereas other people said, well, we could have also picked something like Tokyo or Kyoto, which would have been much more devastating. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were small cities in comparison. So again, it's up to you guys to kind of talk about the morality of it in your assignment, but I'm just kind of giving you some more information here. Now, the bombs were really rather devastating. As you can see here, some pictures from the devastation that were wrought upon by the bombs. Not only the original or the initial blast, which killed many people and destroyed a lot of stuff, but also the radiation fallout that came out from the bombs in the time after the dropping of the bombs. Now, a question that some of you may have is, why can people live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? It's perfectly safe nowadays, compared to like Chernobyl, where people won't be able to live there for like 1,000 years. Well, when the bombs explode, they use up most of their radioactive energy, and very little is left in terms of fallout. Whereas in Chernobyl, because it was a meltdown, it was slowly being leached into the area. That is going to be there's going to be much more radiation for a much longer time, whereas in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the radiation eventually dissipated. So, the two bombs were dropped, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 6th, August 9th. On August 15th or 14th, depending on which time zone you're looking at, the Japanese formally surrendered, which led to VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day, which leads to this very famous photo here on the left, and the war in Japan is over. Now, in fact, this is actually the end of World War II, so chronologically we have to go backwards now to look at Europe. But this essentially ends World War II and then thrusts us basically right away into the Cold War, but we'll talk about that in a few weeks. So, our next question is, what caused the war in Europe, and what were the major battles? So, a brief way to kind of summarize the causes of the war in Europe, and again, we've looked at this already at the beginning of our look at World War II. You can think of the acronym CIA. Think of collaboration, Russia, isolationism, the US, and appeasement, Britain and France. So collaboration, if you guys remember, Russia, they signed a deal with Hitler, Stalin did, to not attack each other and to split Poland. That essentially gave Hitler the green light to invade Poland and fully start World War II. Isolationism, the U.S. wanted to stay out of the war, and so Hitler knew that the U.S. was not going to come in and save the Allies like we did in World War I, and so he basically, again, had another green light to go ahead and do what he wanted to do without fear of the U.S. joining, at least not right away. And finally, appeasement, right? Britain and France were trying to appease Hitler to prevent a war from happening, but this gave Hitler more time to build up his forces and eventually do what he wanted to do, thus fully leading to the start of World War II in Europe. Okay, very briefly, so after Poland was invaded, Germany then invaded Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France using his Blitzkrieg tactics. Blitzkrieg in German means lightning war, essentially a new style of warfare in which tanks and planes would be used to kind of split the opposing army in half, and then the infantry would come in behind to mop up what was left. Very quick movements used to kind of capture a lot of territory very quickly and not give the defenses time to settle down. Hitler wanted to avoid any sort of trench warfare situation like what happened in World War I. In June of 1941, Hitler then broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Russia and invaded. This became known as Operation Barbarossa, would eventually lead to the Battle of Stalingrad, which is the big turning point battle in Europe. And then on December 11th of 1941, after the Japanese had already attacked the U.S. at Pearl Harbor, Hitler also declared war on the U.S., finally bringing all of the major players into World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad would be the turning point battle of Europe. This would eventually turn it from the Germans winning the war to the Allies winning the war. But that was not the only battle, obviously. There were a lot of other major battles which we have to also kind of focus on. So, in November of 1942, the U.S. and the British land at Casablanca, here in North Africa. Let me see if I get my mouse over here. They're going to land at Casablanca. Now, the U.S. are going to move from the west and start moving towards the east to capture Libya, which is controlled by the Italians and the Germans, whereas the British would move from the east in Egypt towards Libya as well. In July of 1943, the British were able to invade Sicily, and then they were able to move up towards Italy. Okay. In June of 1944, the famous Normandy invasion, or D-Day, also known as Operation Overlord, happened, in which the British and Americans landed, and the Canadians as well landed in northern France, and then started to recapture northern Europe and push towards Germany. The final major battle of World War II in Europe was the Battle of the Bulge, in which the Germans launched one last offensive. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because the Allied lines bulged but didn't break. The Germans were able to push into the Allied lines, but they were never able to actually break the lines. Once the Germans were defeated, then the Allies were able to push fully into Germany and capture Berlin. And on May 7th, 1945, we have VE, or Victory in Europe Day. Again, this is a rather brief overview of the major battles. Our focus more is kind of the big picture and how these battles, or how the events of the war impacted people, both soldiers and non-combatants. But just to give you guys a little bit of background, these are the major battles, and you'll need to kind of look at these for your assignment today on Classroom. Okay, here we see some other visuals of the battles. Okay, so Kasserine Pass here, essentially where the Americans coming from Casablanca in Morocco and the British coming from Egypt, they meet, right, and then they move over to Sicily. Then there's a lot of really intense fighting in Italy. Anzio and Monte Cassino being the two most major battles of Italy. They recapture Italy. Mussolini flees Rome. He's eventually captured somewhere in the Alps and executed. And then here we see in France the Battle of Normandy, or the D-Day invasion, the Battle of the Bulge over here. And we see all the major battles. Eventually, it would be the Russians or the Soviets who would actually get to Berlin first. They're the ones who are kind of most responsible for ending or for capturing Germany from the east. And this will eventually lead to the conflict known as the Cold War, which again we'll talk about in a few weeks. Here we see a visual of the Battle of the Bulge, also known as the Ardennes Offensive. Here we see the lines bulging but not breaking. And then, like I said, eventually it was the Soviets who eventually reached Berlin first. On the left here, we see another very famous photo of the war in which Mussolini and his mistress were executed and then hung up on a gas station as kind of a symbol to the rest of the people supporting the fascist regime in Italy. And, of course, World War II was a very, very costly conflict. Here we see the total number of deaths being somewhere between 50 and 85 million. Again, a very big range here, but, records were not as advanced as they were today. And a lot of that was, not necessarily written down perfectly well. So, the last thing you guys are going to do today on the Google Doc is write down what are the most important battles in the Pacific and the European theater, pick and explain 2 from each, and make sure to explain their significance in 2 to 3 sentences. Alright, hope you guys enjoyed, and talk to you next week.